I am Gerrel Jones, of course. Go by Menace to Miracle, TikTok. Interestingly enough, that one post that I made has made me kind of TikTok infamous. I don't know if you saw the one about Republicans or somebody who votes for Trump is not necessarily someone who is against you or against the current government or wants to overthrow it. Anyway, I think a bunch of Trump people followed me as a result of giving them the opportunity to not be villainized. But I definitely am not a Trump supporter, nor am I a Biden supporter. I vote for policy or encourage people to vote for policy. I can't really vote at this time, but I encourage people to vote for policy over partisanship. I have been talking about race, not because it was my intent going into TikTok, but because the subject started coming up as a result of that post. 36,000 people have followed me that was like over a month. And I'm like, everybody wants to talk about, well, if they didn't want to, if it wasn't about the actual homicide that I committed, it was about, why Black people are still grieving or dealing with race, when they weren't slaves. Today's Black people weren't slaves. You get comments like, it doesn't matter, just get over it. Clearly there are people that don't believe that systemic racism exists, that white privilege is a real thing. And so these gave me an opportunity to open up conversation for this. And in the 1 minute clips, it's very difficult to get it all in, but it did create conversation. And so I try not to be rude to people when they say something that I feel like is completely asinine, but sometimes I think the tone comes out anyway. At any rate, I invited a group of people, if they wanted to have a conversation, a very civil conversation about that particular issue. I'll call it navigating race relations in today's climate. What is necessary for it? What is not necessary for it? What kind of conversations? What needs to be a part of the conversation? What does not need to be a part of the conversation? And so you are Frank Vernon. Introduce yourself.
Hi. Yes, that's right. My name is Frank Vernon. I am, if anyone who's watching this can see me, I'm a white man. I'm 44, and I'm the founder and owner of Grave Danger Media, a live streaming educational platform, as well as a media production platform. So that's what I do as far as my business stuff, my personal life. Married, we have 5 kids. My wife and I have 5 kids. 2 of them now are grown-ups. They're my 2 oldest daughters. And then that's who I am. I don't have a story that's quite similar to yours, but I'm sure that we have a lot of similarities in our past. We're going to have a lot of common ground, and I think we might have some disagreements, and any of those are fantastic. I'm just glad that someone's willing to talk. I really appreciate this.
So I wanted to just go ahead and dive in.
Sure.
The question that I was trying to get people to answer when I invited people to this live is, what is necessary to talk about when it comes to navigating race relations in America today? And the reason that I wanted to ask that question was because I have several people who have commented on my post that Black people just need to get over it, right? It's not a thing that, in fact, one of the last posts was, if you keep talking about it, it'll stay here, or it won't go away if you keep talking about it. And so I didn't think that was a rational response. However, I understood more when the author of that post gave context for it. He was talking about teaching people, children, basically from the time they're, growing up, they can understand things if you teach them that they're Black. And I had actually did a post about that. You teach people to grab a hold of labels and identify as those labels, and then those labels end up taking them to places they don't want to go. The tail ends up wagging the dog, so to speak. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think? What part of the conversation, or what's necessary in the conversation to navigate race relations? Number one thing.
The number one thing is communication without one-sided bias, or at least with an open mind. A lot of people will claim they have an open mind, but then you say something that gets on their nerves and they're going to shout right back at you. And that's not really open-mindedness. It's being able to listen to the entire conversation and put it all together. Now, part of what you talked about with one of the commenters you had that said the best thing is to stop talking about it. Part of that I get. The first time I ever heard someone really say that, it was a few years back, maybe a decade ago or so. And it was an interview that Morgan Freeman had with
Yeah,
someone.
Don Lemon.
And yeah, uh, and it makes sense. That struck a chord to me, because my thought is, in the future, I kind of think about like Star Trek scenarios. In the Star Trek scenario, humans encounter aliens, and now humans are just humans. We're all humans together. And in that scenario, there's still the conversation of different colors and different labels, but it's not quite the same. I know this might sound silly, but Klingons don't see different colored people, humans, as different kinds of humans. They see them as humans in the Star Trek universe.
Sure.
And I think that's one of the goals. And I think that if that type of goal is people can just see people as people that happen to have a different type of heritage, that happen to have a different type of cultural experience, but still just be humans. That's what I think the goal of any of those conversations, including this one, in my opinion, should be.
Okay. So this is what I posted, because that's in agreement with what you're saying and I watched the interview with Don Lemon and Morgan Freeman, and I don't agree with Morgan Freeman, but I understand how he came to his conclusions. Let me tell you what I believe is the gap in that argument that makes it a little bit weaker, is that heritage includes history. And because I understand that the impact of events on people's psychology and the way they socialize, it has impact on their spirituality. Those things are brought over into their futures, and they become a part of that heritage. So it's not just that people can stop talking about or just programming their children to believe in race. It's now woven into the system. We teach it in our education system. We teach it in our churches. Every institution that you go get a job at is going to ask you to mark a box, right? So it's not like something you can get away from. Although I recognize that race is not a real thing, the heritage of racism and the impact of racism has ripple effects. And to say that I can stop talking about it or stop telling my kids about it, and by virtue of that, make it go away, I don't think that that's reasonable in the context of the real world that they're going to have to experience. Does that make any sense to you?
It does. Yeah. Because, well, I agree also that race is not exactly a real thing. Um, it's still there still is something that makes someone unique based on who they are, who their parents are, uh, and and things like that. They're going to grow up with whatever religion perhaps that they're taught. I don't, but that can change over time, just like someone can choose to completely change and not embrace and not utilize their own past heritage and just completely do something new. completely different
Right.
because
So,
everyone can be an individual.
okay, so that's what I thought you were saying, is that it does take, and I do agree completely, it takes individuals disregarding the paradigms that they've been given, right? Through the education
Mhm.
system, through the political system, so on and so forth. And I agree with this. And I've made several posts, and in my speaking engagements, I say, burn your labels, burn your symbols. You know, do not let these symbols be a part of your identity. And that comes down to being black and white as well. You cannot be a black man, you cannot be a white man and address things from that perspective. You have to be a human. The idea that you have a lesser or greater amount of melanin in your skin should not be an identifier of your person. Now, when it comes to ethnicity, or where you know, the culture that you have shared with others, that is stuff that is intended to be shared. It's not intended to be hoarded. And that's where that the covetousness about that, trying to protect that, is a part of where I think a part of the problem lies. Nationalism is, to an extreme, um, becomes fascism when it completely grows up. Right now,
Yeah.
I know that sounds, you know, a little bit tough to hear, but if you think about it, when you bring it down to a local level, if I decide that my family is the only thing that is important, my family name, it is the only thing that is important, and I'm going to lift it up above everybody else, and I'm
Mhm.
going to use the resources, or look at other people and other nationalities as resources versus people that I need to be getting invested in so that they can grow as well. Well, that's like personal nationalism. The Jones family is the best family. I'm number one. We're number one, and everybody else is to be conquered or to be used for whatever they can provide for us.
Yeah.
That attitude um, cannot help people prosper, and it cannot help us heal. So that's why I point out that we cannot accept these labels and start to protect these labels, um, if we're going to move forward in discussions of race. But we do have to acknowledge that the history has present ramifications. I'll give some example of that.
Okay.
So you hear people say slavery is over with. None of you have ever been slaves. And it's as if they don't want to acknowledge that cause and effect is a real thing. That at the end of slavery, it was replaced with black codes and Jim Crow. So the marginalization wasn't done with. And when Jim Crow was done with, supposedly done with, you still had redlining, which was a factor in developing, you know, the poverty and low property values and what we call ghettos or hoods today. It's a major factor in that. So when those property values, you know, did not go up, those communities were not able to produce the kind of capital and the kind of environment where businesses would come in and, you know, keep that community from dying. And so now what you have is blight. Today, as a result of those things, those causes and effects, today what you have in these communities is blight. Where you have a lot of blight, you generally will have a lot of crime. And part of that is because you have a high renter volume. And a high renter volume will usually include a high Section 8 or poverty level um, people. So in that comes the lack of funding for schools, because the property values are low and property taxes generally pay for the schooling. And so you don't have well-funded schools. And so you don't have quality education. If you don't have quality education, then you have children that can't navigate life. And then, you know, there's the criminality and the continued cycle of poverty. So now all that comes down from the antecedent, which was chattel slavery. What is your view of that?
My view, again, it aligns a lot with yours, is, in the 1800s, when slavery was officially stopped. I have to say that with air quotes because it didn't
Yeah,
happen instantly. If something happens now, a law can be put into place and the whole country knows about it 20 seconds later. But, the word had to be trickled down. It took years for all the slaves to actually be freed. Some really never were, although that did eventually stop. But if you suddenly have thousands and thousands of people who own nothing, who have possession of nothing, and you say, okay, you're free, go do what you want. Well, they have nothing to work with. And so they had to essentially they had to come together. They had to help each other out. Some didn't want to, some were scared. And then that's when, a lot of this, I think personally, and just based on history classes I took well over 2 decades ago, um, I think that's when a lot of this started. And because a lot of people weren't willing to help them, and there really wasn't an infrastructure built to help, a lot of it continued. And then a lot of the looking down on these other people and looking down on this group, or being afraid of these other people. And, it's just, it's, it's something that it carried for a long time. Um, Now, as far as what you mentioned about, like the Section 8 locations and neighborhoods, those I've seen a lot of that, um, where the mentality was, it was different for me because I never experienced that, but I got to see it as an outsider working in that environment. I actually used to work for a cable company where I'd go and hook up cable for people all the time. It was not a big deal. But it was drastically different when I'd go to these Section 8 neighborhoods, these housing additions, and I would see that they would be clean for the most part because the city would clean them, or the county, or whatever the case would be. But uh, but they didn't really have the drive, the motivation, um, as an entire group to help each other or to move up. And I never really understood why. I guess I still partly don't. I can't say that I ever really
can I help you
will.
with that?
Oh, please. Yes.
All right, so there is a national kind of agreement where we would de facto be um, siloists. 35% of Americans have never spoken to their neighbors. Most studies show 35%. That is 90 million plus people have never spoken to their neighbor. One of the things that my organization does is we put forth this idea of putting the neighbor back in the neighborhood. We create events to teach people how to interact socially. You've heard me on my post talk about, or on my lives talk about, the most powerful influence we know of is social interaction, social influence. But if I don't talk to anybody, then I don't have that. So here's what survival mentality does. And this is where poor people are living. This is the attitude that poor people have. Survival. Survival keeps your amygdala in the game. Your amygdala is your fight or flight, right? So what you're trying to do when you're surviving is eat. You're trying to get, you're trying to take, you're trying to get as much as you can. So you don't really see people as human beings. You see them as opportunities. It's a mindset that causes you to objectify. Now I recognize that this is also something you described about the business, that they don't really care, right? They just, they objectify people, and they but this is a social thing as well. When you're living in neighborhoods where you're on survival mode, you don't even go greet your neighbors. You don't knock on the door. You don't do any of that stuff. What you do is you put up burglar bars if somebody new moves in and you don't know them, and you hope they don't have bad kids. And so this idea, right? So this idea of what we call the hood is a result of de-emphasizing relationships with people in the, so neighbor is de-emphasized. And so that's why we call it the hood instead of the neighborhood. People are repping locations rather than actually representing the people. And because of things like Section 8, and I'm not saying that Section 8 is a bad thing, I'm just saying that, you have a rotation of people. You don't have, when you have a high renter population, you have a little retention. So you don't have relationships that are long lasting because people are always moving out. And so you'll have a group of people that are like in Birmingham, we have a neighborhood called Titusville, North Titusville, and the home ownership population is 18%. That is very low. Now, most of those people are 60 to 80, 85 years old that own those homes. They've owned them forever. But they have no desire, no motivation to interact with the younger generations that are rotating in and out, because sometimes those younger generations, particularly if they're in survival mode and poor people, are bringing drama. And so they don't want to deal with it. And so again, the reasons for people not interacting. And there's another aspect too. And I've said this publicly, that you've heard of white flight.
I can't say I have.
Okay, white flight was when neighborhoods were integrated and white people decided they didn't want to live with black people. And so they fled to the suburbs. Like towns like Inslee, where I'm from, right? Used to be, we got mansions over here that were basically abandoned, right? And so white people flew out to the other neighborhoods. And so after that, though, there was this thing called black flight that people don't talk about a lot, because white people had set the standard for what success was. And when I say white people, I don't mean all white people. I mean that whoever writes the narrative for what success is, whoever defines for us what success is, they were white people. It's not all white people, but there were white people that designed that. And so affluence was defined by white people. Success was defined by white people. And it just happened that those white people had a white supremacist attitude. It was white superiority. So when black people started getting affluence, the only measurement for their success was whatever white people had done. So you had to get white people education. You had to learn how to speak white people language. You had to learn how to wear white people clothes. You had to learn, and your goal was to learn how to make white people money. And when you did that, you wanted to move into white people neighborhoods and get away from the black people, because that was the attitude that white people had. And so you got this phrase that sounds innocuous. I'm just trying to get out the hood. I want to get my family out the hood. I want to get my family out of here, right? Mm-hmm. But in actuality, what is happening is that when people who are gifted and are able to achieve and overcome, when they move out to those neighborhoods with white people, they take with them their sweat equity, their social capital, meaning their time and attention. They take their intellectual capital, and they take their financial resources. And I think I said sweat equity as well, with them. And so they're leaving people who are still dealing ineffectively with trauma, generational trauma. And we know from the study of epigenetics that it literally can be passed down in the genes. And we know that many people in the underserved communities that I work in are suffering from undiagnosed mental health issues. And then you have a high number of people incarcerated as a result of, criminality that comes from those things that I spoke of earlier. And so the only place that they can go is back to those communities and perpetuate the madness, because, it's very difficult for anybody to want to employ you when you are as dysfunctional as that and you have been incarcerated. So all those factors play a role in why people are not interacting with each other in ways that would benefit one another. They're in survival mode. In short, they're in survival mode. They don't think of building community. They think of building their own family, or just feeding their own family. And everybody is an object to them and not don't even understand how to use their social influence to better their community. That was
Okay.
long, wasn't it?
There was, but it makes a lot of sense. Um, the first thing you said that really struck me was neighbors don't talk to each other, and I got to think about my own self. um, I have spoken to one neighbor who lived across the street. Well, a couple, and then when they moved away, like 2 years ago, that was it. And I don't know anyone in my neighborhood at all, which is this is definitely a problem. I'm guilty of that. So I can definitely see where that would be an issue uh, for anyone. But then you have a group, they're all going through a very similar experience that isn't necessarily ideal. Maybe they don't want, maybe they do want it. Some people do, but I know many don't. Then there's no conversation to actually move on. Now, um, this is a fantastic conversation.
Rich,
So
right?
yeah,
Didn't expect this, did you?
this is great. Um, as far as things like trauma and being able to get past trauma, I know that can be a major challenge. And as far as undiagnosed mental problems, emotional problems, those are big challenges. Um, I think about, so I read a lot of business books, or maybe I should say I listen to a lot of business audiobooks. Um, a lot of these business books, um, I like to read the ones, some of them that are just generally um, about business practices in general that don't necessarily have to do with someone's backstory or what they had to overcome. Those are good technical manuals, if you will, I guess. I think about one of the most popular in the world, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I love that book. And that's really what got me started in business, by Robert Kiyosaki. And, he does talk about some of the struggles growing up as a child growing up, um, as a Japanese American living in Hawaii, eventually joined the Marines. He was looked down on because he, he was in the Marines during the time of the Vietnam War. So he was walking around with his military haircut, and everyone else around him seemed to be hippies with long hair, and he was spat on and all this kind of stuff. But he overcame a lot of that, but that wasn't really the core of his story. The core of his story is how to build a business. But then there's other people who tell stories of how they built their business where they had some major struggles and it was just ridiculous. Uh like Kevin Hart's book, The Decision. I think that's his newest book. I think I've gone through that 4 times now. He's gone through all kinds of craziness, horrible problems in his childhood, a very overbearing mother, uh, which could be a blessing, but he didn't see it that way at the time. He eventually did when he grew up, but he also had a lot of those issues. He might be worth $1 billion now, but he certainly wasn't when he was a kid. No one in his family was. Um, and so those types of things, it's like he's the one-off person who then who did go and build up his business, and he and his team are making $100 million a year now. um at least that's according to him, from an interview like 2 years ago or a year ago, something like that. And that's great, but if he doesn't go, when he leaves to go pursue what he wants to do, that causes a bit of a problem to some people, well, like I'm one of them in a way that conflicts with what you were saying, because at some point, how much does someone
Right.
need to be obligated to not leave when they
Okay.
found success? And now success means, well, I have to move to LA because I made this big thing, or I have to move to New York
Right.
because I made this big thing.
Yeah.
Um, and if they suddenly, like my wife started a business and with her best friend, and they do coding. They make apps for iPhones and iPads and Macs. Um, but there's people who, like the guy in, I forgot what country it was, some little bitty country, who made Flappy Bird, and he was making $65,000 a day on Flappy Bird.
Wow.
Um, I know it's not the same as like, it's not an American story, but it is still a
I agree.
story. Like in that sense, suddenly he's now he's worth millions, tens of millions.
Right.
Should he stay there where he is? Could it even be dangerous for him to stay where he is?
So that's a very, very interesting question. Okay, so I love that question, and it's very, very important. Um, so this is what it comes down to. What do you believe your purpose is,
Mhm.
um, versus the goals of that the world has given you for success? Does your purpose change because of finance? Okay, so here this is what I mean by that. So today, I've been out of prison for about 8.5 years. I spent 23 years total in prison from the time that I was 20 to the time I was 45. When I got out, I was 45 years old, had nothing. I had to go to a halfway house. Uh, a friend, my cousins let me move into their home uh, for a little while, and then the guy that got me out of prison, who was I don't know if you know this story about the Trump supporter, a good old boy, Springville, Alabama, moved me into his home, and I stayed there for 3.5 years until I was able to develop, um, enough success. Finally, get jobs. First, I had to start a business. I had to start a lawn care service, and then I enrolled at UAB. I was psychology and African American studies double major. Ended up getting a partial scholarship and all that
My
stuff.
oldest daughter goes to UAB right now.
Is that right?
Yeah, she's in UA. She's there. She's in Birmingham right now.
Wow, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So they held up my registration because of my criminal history, which I'm sure is a civil rights violation. But I ended up getting a partial academic scholarship. I just wanted to go to
Yeah.
school. I just wanted to go to school to
Hmm.
prove that I knew, because I had spent 20 years studying that my dysfunction and helping other people while I was in prison, building programs and all that. So
Hmm.
the thing is, though, when I got to the place where I was the first black man trained in violence reduction in the city of Birmingham, I was working with the government. I was paid by UAB and the Community Foundation of Greater Birmingham. I had some notoriety, um, and I could buy a house. I was only making 31.5, right? But I had been working for I had business. I'd been, this is 4.5 years out of prison. I can buy $100,000 house. I was living in Springville. Now, Springville is a very rural town, and the place that I lived was the top of a hill called Miracle Hills Road, and it overlooked a canyon. And hummingbirds came and greeted me in the morning. And there were the only times you heard gunshots is if somebody had bagged a deer, right? It was awesome,
Hmm.
beautiful. And I decided to buy my home in my own old neighborhood, uh, $58,000. And it was the
Hmm.
neighborhood that had the highest number of homicides. Now, for me, purpose is what dictated me buying this house in the neighborhood that had the highest number of homicides. And nobody came to greet me. I had to go knock on their doors and introduce myself and use my social influence. Today, the house is worth $74,000. That's 3 years ago, 2017. I bought it 3.5 years ago. And the property values will probably go up as we continue to have influence and continue to teach people how to interact with each other, work together, so on and so forth. But again, purpose dictated what I did. Now, this year I'll probably make more money than I've ever made. Hopefully, I'll make more money than I've ever made in my life. Will I
I
stay
hope
in
so
this
too.
house? Huh?
I hope so too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going to show you how you can help with that, right?
Okay.
But,
Okay.
but you know, will I stay in this house? Absolutely not. I won't stay in this house. But largely, it's because I have a wife that doesn't want to stay in this house. My wife doesn't really. She supports me, but she's not really that mission minded, right?
Hmm.
So she's got to have it, and she's got to be priority. But I will still maintain property and maintain influence in those communities because I know that my social capital is important. I know that my um, uh, financial resources are important. I know that my intellectual capital is important. I know my sweat equity is important. I cannot abandon, but that's purpose. So a person has to decide, you know, what, you know, who they are in that. And I can't dictate to someone who they should be in that. I'm
Hmm.
just saying that the fact that people leave does leave a hole. And if they abandon or if they never had that as a purpose, um, when they do leave, it leaves a hole. And I would encourage people to that if you don't want to immerse yourself in like I did, at least support the people that are. I mean, I have a nonprofit organization, support the people that are going to be immersed and doing that work because you simply love people and you know, it's a good thing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that does. So yeah, so it's essentially it's on the individual to do what they can or do what they feel that they should. Um, we both know that a lot of people could be doing a lot more and probably should be doing a lot more that don't do either. They either do nothing or they don't do much at all when they can do more.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. I was gonna talk about how some people overcome trauma because another one of the things that people say again is, you know, when talking about race and black people and how some black people address race and using the backdrop of slavery, Jim Crow, and marginalization, historical marginalization as, and they say you can't use that as an excuse. And my response to that is that it's not about excuses, it's about math. And so oftentimes they'll point to people like Candace Owens or other successful people, Morgan Freeman, you know, who have the, you know, the attitude that, hey, you know what, I can do it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. And so this is how I address that. I grew up in an extremely dysfunctional situation. And I've talked about it before, but, and I talked about it in my speaking deck. Um, you know, my mother was 15 years old when she got pregnant with me. She didn't marry my biological father. He was a drug addict and alcoholic, drank himself to death at 39. She married my stepfather, whose mother was 12 when she got pregnant with him, and gave him to her older sisters to raise, who were, one of them was a, what we call a pissy drunk. I think in white vernacular, that would be a lush. And so he grew up in that environment in a shotgun house in Birmingham, Alabama. And my mother was pimped out by her parents and grandparents. And so just trauma. I was born legally blind. You know, we got beatings. You know, mother put a gun to my head when I was 17. Right. You know, just horrible environment to grow up in. So how do you overcome that type of trauma and become a success today? People, if you can do it, you go spend 20 and a half years in prison, you get out and you hit the ground running and you're doing awesome things and people want you to run for city council, right? I've literally been asked to run for city council. I'm on parole, serving a life sentence, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I've written a couple of books, a couple of novels, simple fiction novels that I really like. I don't know how well written they are, but yeah, the point is that people will look at me and they'll say, if you can do it, anybody can do it. Well, the bad news is that I'm an outlier. I'm not what you should compare the norm to. And I had to accept responsibility for that being the truth because I used to think that if I could do it, anyone could do it. But my situation was very different, and the skills that I naturally was, or the talents that I was naturally born with, are very different. And we've got to realize that people, that back to that individualism, people are different, and the impact of historical acculturation and events, difficult events in life, traumatic events in life, people respond to it differently. And we've got to deal with epigenetics. What are people being passed down? Is it manic depression? Is it predisposition to alcoholism? Is it psychosis? Right? Everybody doesn't have the same gray matter, makeup, and so it's unfair to say that because Morgan Freeman or Kevin Hart or anybody made it out, that somehow minimizes the significance of the people who did not make it out and are not doing well. I'm saying that if it's only 10% that are not doing well, if your employer didn't pay you 10% of the time, would you change something? If your roof leaked 10% of the time, would you address it? If your child failed 10% of their grades, would you address something? You see what I'm saying? So, we have this way, these reasons that I think are weak justifications. Just because somebody else is successful doesn't mean that, and overcame their trauma doesn't mean that all people should have the same ease at overcoming their trauma. And I'm crazy as hell. I haven't overcome my trauma. I just cope with, all the things that are, all the things that my wife knows everything about me. So, she knows I'm crazy. Just cope with it, bro.
Right. Yeah. Coping can be really hard to do for a lot of people. Like a lot of people, I also had a lot of childhood trauma that it stayed with me. It wasn't as bad as some, and it was worse than others. It's well, I haven't finished my first book. I am in the process of writing one about that, but it's about kind of who I have become because of what I experienced when I was young. And I tried to make some comparisons toward the end of the book about other people that I've met along the way in my life, friends, family, whatever, who I know their past, and I know who they are now. And I think about how they would be different if fill in the blank didn't happen to them, or fill in the blank did happen to them. How would their life be different now? I don't know a lot of people personally that had a childhood as rough as mine, at least at the very young ages. Most of my biggest problems happened earlier than 7 years old. But the thing is, I didn't even realize until maybe 3 years ago how much those things affected me.
Right.
And I'm 44 now.
Right.
So it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it's scary. It's scary to think about someone who had to go through it until they're 20 or until they're 30. Starting off as an infant, going through just a crap life until you're halfway done with life. That makes things very difficult. And so, yeah, to be an outlier, that's true. It's not a one-on-one comparison. Yeah. So Kevin Hart, there was something about him on the inside that he decided he's going to go for whatever he wanted to go for, regardless of the consequences.
And I think that another
partly
part
based. Yeah, I was going to say that's partly based on his experiences. He kind of had nothing to lose.
There you go.
If he went for something, why not?
Yeah.
It's just, who cares? If it doesn't work, you're still in the exact same spot.
Exactly.
So,
and my wife pointed that out to me last night. She said, you've been through everything. So I'll do stuff that, is like borderline, just, if not even borderline, just crazy. Right. Without getting too detailed. Right. But it's like the reason that you do those things, or part of the reason, is because you've been to hell. And it's like, well, what are they? It's not criminal. right? So
Mhm.
you just don't have, you start a business, you know, if it fails, it fails. If it, you know what I'm saying? You know, go do something that nobody else is doing. If it fails, it fails. What are they going to do? Put me in prison? Not hardly, right? You know,
Right.
so I've been beat to within an inch of my life, so to speak. I've been, you know, the edge of death. I've been a crackhead. And so, I mean, what is there to lose? Try comedy. Go. I've done stand up, you know, what didn't go over very well, doesn't matter. I just did it, you know, just sitting in the
Yeah.
bar one day at open mic, let's go. You know.
Hmm.
Anyway, um, yeah, and I think that is the part. But the other part is also is that people like that tend to pick up support, and I did. I picked up just, you know, people. Um, well, there's two things for me. One was that I had given myself over completely to the idea that I was here for other people. That my life was not for me. And so that became a drive. And I need to do that because when I'm selfish and self-centered, bad things happen. So it's not just for them. It's like in order for me to survive, you know, I have to be altruistic. And so people want those kind of people in their lives, you know, people that are recklessly selfless, and open doors tend to open. Uh, you volunteer at places, you show up and you provide for needs. You look through the faults to get down to the need. And you know, my acronym for love is lift others and value everyone, right? So it's a principle, and you know, it helps me to cope with the trauma. It makes me relevant, makes my purpose uh, tangible. You know, I don't have to
Hmm.
guess, and so I think that those are factors that help people too.
Yeah.
Listen, why don't we? We've been here for a good while now.
Yeah. It's been a while.
Hour and
Uh,
so, a little over an hour. Or oh no, is it not? It's only 10:11. We got here a little after 9. We started about 9:21. So let's go back and recap.
sure.
So the question at hand was, what is necessary for the conversation, and what is not necessary for the conversation um, in navigating race relations. Um, I have, we have, I think, agreed that uh, understanding heritage and history is relevant because of the impact that the ripples will have in today. I don't think people need to live as victims, but I do believe that people need to live in awareness. And I think that awareness provides an opportunity for you to have compassion and sensitivity for people who say that they are struggling with something rather than objectifying them. And every individual doesn't come out of that struggle the same way. Some people come out like Kevin Hart and me. Other people uh, are crushed. And this is a good place to reference Langston Hughes. Are you familiar with him?
Not really. Sorry.
It's okay.
I
So
don't
he
know who
was a
that is.
Harlem Renaissance. He was a Harlem Renaissance poet. Harlem Renaissance was in the 20s, and it was a bunch of black artists got together, and he wrote a poem called Harlem. It's a very short poem, and it says, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun?" You might remember that from a movie, yeah,
Hmm.
or a book. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotted meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Now, on the surface, the poem seems, what is that, right? You know, what happens to a dream deferred? The dream deferred part comes from a Christian scripture or a Bible verse. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. So he borrows that and says, what happens
Hmm.
to a dream deferred? And he's talking about the experience of Black people and the different manifestations of what happens when their hope is suppressed, when their hope is taken away. Some dry up like a raisin in the sun, and you can see that psychological uh, manifestation in their behavior. Some fester like a sore and then run, you know, and you can see that. You can kind of imagine what that behavior looks like. Does it stink like rotted meat? Maybe you're looking at an alcoholic or someone who's overcome with heroin or some addiction, or crust and
Hmm.
sugar over like a syrupy sweet. And that reminds me of the kind of Aunt Jemima or Sambo type figure, the comedian, right? Crust and sugar over, just laugh it off and be sweet. And then maybe it just sags like a heavy load, and that's the person that's always depressed. Or does it explode, which is a reference to violence, is a reference to, the anger at the hope being deferred. And so it's really a deep poem when you think about it. And I reference it here because, again, everybody doesn't manifest their reactions to historical trauma and the heritage of oppression in America of minorities, particularly Black people, the same way. So what else did we say?
We talked about I should have been taking notes. I'm sorry. We talked about the conversation of being able to be open and talk to people as people, instead of talking to someone with a label and not having. We didn't really talk about so much agenda, but I think it's good when people can set their agendas aside and just talk. And then they can come up with a new agenda together, as long as the agenda isn't always bad. Agenda is just a plan or an idea or something. But there's got to be something new. There's got to be something where, much like you were saying in your very popular, awe-inspiring, and number-inducing TikTok, that just because someone is a Trump supporter doesn't mean they're a racist. That type of scenario, that's true. That type of mentality can't be used on either side of the conversation. If there's going to ever be any progress, there's got to be something different. And being able to go through the process of talking with someone, which I get to do pretty regularly because of like all my business partners, we have these conversations all the time. I happen to be the only white person who is associated with my business, Grave Danger Media. That's not because I choose that. That just happened to be because when I was looking for people to help me out with my business, I just happened to find the best people I could find. Most of them were friends of mine, and others were people that were suggested to me from my friends. It just happens to come out. But since we're all friends and we're all friendly with each other, and none of us expect each other to be the same, we do occasionally, once a month or so, we'll have conversations like this. I'd love to bring them all on. It'd be great.
Would be great. It would be great, and I'll definitely do it.
Yeah. So I'll talk to them. I'll see if we can get. There's 4 of us right now. No, wait, sorry. There's 5. I forgot about Al. He's brand new to the group. So, but I think it would be great to have this conversation. And some of them are. 2 of the guys are pretty far left as far as generic, I guess you could call it like stereotypical left. But I wouldn't call any of them extreme one way or the other. I think the extreme is where the problem is. I think the extreme closed-mindedness on either side is where the problem is. Or at least that's where some of the problem is. It's definitely not all the problem, but that's where some of the problem is.
All right. Let me ask this while we're here, and I'm gonna if you have any closing remarks, that would be awesome.
Okay.
What you thought about the conversation? Is it important? I don't know, whatever. What you would like to say to people.
Right. This is a fantastic way to start a conversation. Obviously, I didn't have notes. I wasn't prepared for it. You put out an invitation for it an hour before it started, and I saw the invitation maybe 15 minutes before it started. So, I didn't have time to necessarily reference anything or bring anything other than just my own thoughts. I didn't know how many people were going to be in this conversation. So the fact that it started at all is glorious. And I don't mean that in an exaggerated way. It really is glorious. It is fantastic. And a lot of people are not willing to talk because they're either afraid to, like, I don't mind saying my business name, but some people don't want to associate any type of political thoughts or any type of uh, problem conversations with their business. I think that everyone should be able to just speak about what they want to speak about without being told that they are racist or told that they are hateful or told that they are one-sided in some way, when maybe that's not true in their heart. People people are just different people. Everyone is a person. Um, but the conversation of how to deal with the present and the future of the problem of racism uh, as it is now and as it will be in the future, and hopefully will be overcome in the future, probably not in our lifetime, but how it will be, it's got to start with open conversations without screaming. um, you and I definitely see a lot of things eye to eye, and I appreciate that, but I think it would be good to have hopefully we can get bigger audience. I wouldn't mind participating in this again. um, but to get a bigger group of people to talk with more diverse ideas who can still be civil and not scream at each other and not call each other names.
Yeah, that'd be
um,
awesome. And I'm gonna try to do that.
that sounds great. So hopefully I brought some value to the conversation with just what little input I had. I know it's not tremendous, but it
Healthy
it is what
value.
it is.
Yeah, it's awesome. I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming on. I was hoping that more would, and but maybe this will be a good seed for that in the future. All right, so this has been Gerrel, Minutes to Miracle, and this has been Frank Vernon of Danger
Grave
Media,
Danger Media.
Grave Danger Media, founder
Yes.
CEO. Is that right?
Founder and CEO. Yes, sir.
Founder CEO, Grave Danger. Want to give you that plug just in
Yes.
case this goes viral. And it's been
Absolutely.
you've been very gracious with your conversation, man. I appreciate it. Thank
I'm
you.
definitely happy to have more. Thanks.